You're listening to Little Green Cheese, episode 61. Well, welcome back, Curd Nerds. I'm Gavin Weber, and this podcast is where you can learn about cheese making at home. Well, what a cheesy weekend I didn't have. I was busily working on some of our other workshops that we teach at Little Green Workshops. This weekend I was helping Kim teach a candle making workshop. Very exciting stuff, but we have lots of fun anyway. On the cheese front, I did taste some of the feta that I made the previous weekend, and my goodness, it is absolutely delicious. By using a 100% goat's milk in that feta, I found that it has started to go crumbly fairly quickly after about a week and a half now. In fact, we had some yesterday, and the flavour is just amazing, an amazing taste. It's just salty enough, just right. It's not overpowering, which is good, and I would compare it to any store-bought Greek feta that you could buy at the supermarket or at any market that sells, or any cheesemonger that sells authentic Greek feta. So I'm very impressed. I'm quite chuffed that it turned out the way it certainly did. One thing I have been planning is to create another video series, as well as the two that I'm doing at the moment, the Ask the Cheese Man and the Saturday show, which is around making a cheese tutorial or a taste test, and that is actually tasting some of the local cheeses we have here in Australia and some of the imported ones we're starting to be able to get our hands on now. They're not raw milk cheeses, but some of the pasteurised cheeses coming out of Europe, we're actually being able to get our hands on some of the more unusual ones. In fact, today I picked up a Tellagio, which is actually encased in a white wax, of all things. Those who are familiar with Tellagio will know that it is a red washed rind cheese that comes in a big it's in a big square. It's a big square cheese that's only about, say, 2 inches high, which is, 5 centimetres. And the little block I got is about 5 centimetres long by 1 centimetre high by 2 centimetres long. It's really tiny little piece of cheese, and it cost me like $10 Australian. It looks like the local Coles supermarket, it's one of the supermarket chains we have here in Australia, are stocking a whole bunch of international cheeses. So I was thinking of doing a weekly cheese board, for want of a better word, calling it Gavin's cheese board or something like that, and tasting and trying all these different cheeses that I probably never have tasted. Usually the first taste of these types of cheeses are when I make them myself. So I might get on the front foot and try some of these commercially made cheeses or even artisanal cheeses that some of the local cheese makers around here in Victoria anyway have been making. I know there's a fairly good goat's dairy around here called Meredith Dairy that are just up the road in Ballarat, and they do a wicked goat's cheeses. And I know that we have some really good cheese-making dairies down in the Otway Ranges and some fantastic ones in Gippsland here in Victoria as well. So I'm very excited to be starting something like that very soon. I've got to get a few videos under my belt before I release that series, and that'll be a weekly one. I'm not sure which day that'll be on as well. So hoping to bring that to you all very soon, those who follow not only the podcast here, the audio-only podcast, but the video channel cheeseman.tv. Anyway, so the first round of questions will be, as always, an extract from the Ask the Cheese Man series. So these questions are from Ask the Cheese Man episode 12. So let's get on with the show. Lorraine McLaughlin writes from Shepherdsville, Kentucky. I've forgotten a cheese in the back of the fridge, probably made it 18 months ago. I didn't mark it, so I don't even know what kind it is. As I peeled off the red wax, I saw a rather large patch of black mould. My question is it safe to cut this out and try tasting the cheese? Or is it best to toss it? And are there any cheeses that can be made with heavy cream? I have a quart that needs to be used up somehow. Love the podcasts. Okay, Lorraine, first question is your black mould. Well, it depends on how deep the black mould goes. If it's just surface, then try and scrape it off. And if it's just on the surface, no problems at all. Just wash it off with a little bit of vinegar, white vinegar or apple cider vinegar, doesn't really matter. And then that'll be fine. If it's started to eat into the cheese and the black mould's gone a bit deeper, you can cut that part out and the rest of the cheese will still be okay. If it's got right into the cheese and you can see it has gone fairly deep, then it depends on how infected you think the cheese is. Black mould is not good. It produces a toxin. It is not good to eat, and it can give you food poisoning. So err on the side of caution if it's got right into your cheese. So the next question about how much, so what can you do with lots of cream? You could make a double or triple brie. Lots of recipes in lots of great cheese making cookbooks. You could try a Stilton that uses a fair bit of cream as well, if you make a fairly big batch of that. You could turn it into mascarpone, which uses a lot of cream, and make a very nice tiramisu, which is a delicious dessert. So you could give all of those a try. Thanks for your question, Lorraine. Now, the next question's from Kerrie via email. She says, "Hi, Gavin. I've been asked to make some camel cheese. It's only got 2% fat. Do you think I am best to mix it with cow's milk? All the literature I have read said it's hard to form a good curd. Any ideas, because it's such a good opportunity and it's very expensive? Thanks, Kerrie." Well, Kerrie, I've never come across camel's milk. I know it's well used within the Middle East, and it's a very popular milk there. I've done a bit of research for you and have found that it makes a very nice soft cheese. And the most popular soft cheese is called labna, which is basically a yogurt cheese. It's basically a curd, a very soft curd cheese, which they curdle it, acid set, hang it in a butter muslin, and basically it's just a soft cheese. It's very similar to a ricotta that's been hung in a cheesecloth. Now, if you wanted to make something a little bit harder, then yeah, I would add it to say 50-50 camels to cow's milk to get a better structure. If you're going to add some rennet to the milk to get a firmer curd structure, so you could try that. I hope that answers your question, Kerrie, and best of luck with your camel's milk. Okay, the next question is from Glen Morrow, and he left that via YouTube. He asks, how can you measure the pressing pressure? And I think he's referring to the press that I use on the channel, which I do sell on my shop. So in answer to your question there, Glenn, it has a compression spring, which is rated at 50 pounds or 22 kilos of pressure when it is fully closed. So basically you have to put 22 kilos of weight on the spring to make it close up fully. So when it's fully closed, I know I'm applying 22 kilos of pressure onto the cheese. Now, that doesn't equal to 22 kilos, what do they call it, kilopascals of pressure. And in pounds, it's not 50 pounds per square inch. It's just 22 kilos of weight applied onto the cheese. So half closed would be 11 kilos or 25 pounds. Quarter closed would be 5.5 kilos or 12.5 pounds. So roughly it's a guesstimate, right? So it's a rough estimation. You can get your own compression spring. You can test it by put it on top of a scale and then applying weight to it to see how much weight then closes the spring, and then you'll get a good idea on what that is rated at. But really, when it comes down to it, it's the end result that matters. It doesn't matter how you press your cheese, it is the end result. I had an observation the other day from another YouTuber, another person left a comment on the channel that said, because I'm using a compression spring, do I have to retighten it all the time? Well, the answer to that is yes, of course, because as the cheese gets pressed, the spring expands again. So when over that initial, say, first 30 minutes, I go back at, say, the 15-minute mark, and then I retighten the spring again. Same as if it's pressed for an hour lightly, I then go back and retighten the spring again. Over that initial, then probably 12 hours, then I'll retighten the spring at, say, every 2 or 3 hours, and then when I go to bed, I just leave it. Especially for the hard cheeses when they're tightened all the way down to 50 pounds to 22 kilos. Just before I go to bed, I just make sure that they're tightened all the way down. So, work with what you've got. If you make your own press, then you'll have to figure out how to calculate the weights and all that sort of stuff. There are lots of presses out there on the market for sale. Like I said, we have one in our shop. There are lots of good ones out there, and there are lots of fantastic homemade ones. A lot of home cheese makers make themselves. I actually have a post on littlegreencheese.com. Just go there and there's a search bar and look for homemade cheese presses. And there are, I think I showcased about 4 or 5 from other cheese makers who made them themselves. They're pretty good. I was really impressed, and there's photos and everything. So check that out. I'll put a link in the description below. So the patron of the week is Peter Wilson. Thanks for your support, Peter. If you'd like to support the channel so I can make new and interesting cheeses and cheese-related content like this video, then please support me via Patreon. Yes, indeed, you can support the show by going to littlegreencheese.com/support. It's as easy as that. You'll get taken away to Patreon, where you can pledge your support and keep the shows coming. Anyway, let's take a little bit of a segue, shall we? Now, during last week's appeal, I made a video that showcased this podcast over on my YouTube channels. One thing that I had neglected to do. Now, I think I might have mentioned it last show, and the response in the form of voicemail questions has been overwhelming, and I'm very surprised, and I'm chuffed to bits. This week we have not 1, not 2, not 3, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 voicemail questions to answer on the show. So I'm very excited. So without further ado, let's get stuck into this. The first one is from Gaines.
Hi, Gavin. My name is Gaines. First off, thank you very much for your YouTube videos on cheese making. It's something I am considering getting into, and I've been enjoying them very much. So well done. The question I have is to do with the water you use. I heard you mentioned in one of your videos that you use rainwater, and I was just wondering how you collect and store that to keep it sanitized. I gather from a bit of research that the tap water here in Australia contains chloramine, and I was just wondering, in your experience, is chloramine bad for the cheese making process? Is it okay to use tap water, or do you need a pure water source? Thank you very much. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
No probs, Gaines. Thanks very much for your question. Well, to answer that, yes, we do have chloramine in the water supply, which is fairly standard in the Western world these days. The only reason that I use filtered water now. So I do have rainwater tanks on our property, and a lot of rural and semi-urban places within Australia do use rainwater tanks that they collect off their roofs via their gutters and keep the rainwater tanks for drinking and even for their potable water. So what they normally do is then pass that through either a UV filter, through a coarse filter first, a sand filter, or a canister filter, and then they pass it through a UV filter, or in the case of us, all I do is pass it through a canister filter and then through a charcoal filter to get rid of any bacteria or what have you that may be lurking in there. And then if worse comes to worse, then I put it in the kettle and boil it. But these days, because we purchase water in bulk for our workshops, I actually tend to use the stuff that's left over from the workshops. We buy pure water in bulk, 10-litre cartons. So I tend to use that now instead of the rainwater. I use that mainly for irrigating the vast vegetable gardens that I have. So I've kind of stopped doing that. Now, as for the reason I do that is because the chloramine in the water supply actually reacts with the rennet and neutralizes it. So that's why I say in all the cheese making videos and all the recipes that I supply in my cheese making book that I wrote to use non-chlorinated water, because it does. It has a neutralizing action on the rennet. So if you use chlorinated water, your rennet won't work, basically. So, but you can, after you put the rennet in and it's coagulated your milk, you can, if you're using a wash curd cheese recipe like Gouda or Edam or Havarti, then you can use normal tap water. That's fine, potable water, straight from the tap that has chlorine in it. That's no problems at all. You can use tap water to make your brine. Just make sure that you boil it and then bring it back down again, just to kill any bacteria if you think your water supply is suspect. But that's the only reason. It nullifies the rennet action. So there you go. Thanks for your question, Gaines. All right, the next question is from Joe.
Hey, Gavin, it's Joe, in the United States. My question is about doing cheese caves. Got one now that's kind of a modified wine cooler with a thermometer, hygrometer in there. Can't seem to get the humidity above 75%. Let me know what you'd recommend. Thanks.
Thanks for your question, Joe. Now, there's two things I can recommend. That is to get a humidifier, and there are a few on the market that you can plug in to your main supply. You fill it full of water and it sprays a mist into your cheese cave, and you can get your humidity up fairly high, certainly between 80 and 90%. But with that comes the risk of a lot of mould in your cheese cave. But if you've got a fairly big fridge, then that is a good possibility. You can use that. But that is really only if you're going to be maturing your cheeses with a natural rind, or you're going to be making one of a lot of the same variety. Say you're a artisanal cheesemaker and you're going to be making lots of, say, Reblochon or lots of Camembert, and you need the humidity fairly high just for that one variety of cheese, then that's when I would suggest doing something like that. Now, in this day and age, we have some wonderful technology, two wonderful technologies that can keep the humidity fairly high. And in fact, three technologies. So one, you can wax your cheese and you don't really have to worry too much about the humidity. You can leave it at about the 70%, 75% mark that you have currently, and the wax will stay very pliable and your cheese will remain very moist underneath the wax, and you should be fine. The second technology is to vac pack it in plastic, and you don't have to worry about the humidity at all because the plastic is not porous and the moisture will remain within your cheese. So that's all well and good. Now, what about the mould ripened cheeses and the natural rind cheeses that you want to make? Well, that's where the good old ripening box comes in. So your mould ripened cheeses will be within a ripening box with the lid on, and you can put a little small container, a small plastic container with a bit of water in it, and keep the lid on tight, and that maintains the humidity around about 85 to 95% humidity. Same with washed rind cheeses. If you're making a Tellagio, like I mentioned at the start of the show, or a Munster, then yes, same thing. Just put a little bit of water inside your ripening box or a wet paper towel, and that'll keep the humidity up fairly high as well. For natural rind cheeses, what I tend to do there is put them into ripening box, but I have a special one which is basically a microwave rice cooker. It's a red plastic tub with a clear lid, and it's got a little pop top, so you can open that up, and it lets a bit more of the moisture out, so it keeps the humidity about 80 to 85%. And I find that if I elevate it's got a mat in the bottom that elevates it, but what I do, I put a bamboo mat, sushi mat underneath that, and then underneath that I put a moistened paper towel, and that keeps it between 85 and 90% humidity with a little top pop that takes it down to about 80, which is perfect for natural rind cheeses like, say, Gruyere or the Piora that I'm ripening at the moment, and, say, Caerphilly, if you wanted to make a Caerphilly, or even the Asiago that I made. But that was only for 3 weeks. If you were going to ripen that all the way up to a year, then yeah, you could naturally ripen that in a maturation box. Fairly simple. So there's 3 technologies you could use without having to buy a humidifier to get your humidity up in your cheese fridge. I hope that helps, Joe. On to the next question. This one is from Henri.
Hello, Gavin. This is Henri from Finland. I have a question. Does the shape of the cheese affect aging? I have 110 millimeter and 150 millimeter molds, and so which one do you prefer to use if I have 6 liters of milk?
Thanks for your question, Henry, all the way from Finland. That's a first. Fantastic. Thank you very much, mate. For a 6 litres of milk cheese, which is a fairly small batch, I would opt for your smaller mould, so the 110 millimetre, which is about 5 inches for those who still do imperial. So the smaller the amount of milk, the smaller mould you should use, because there's less chance of the cheese drying out during aging. The larger the mould, obviously, the more amount of milk you're going to use, because if you use a large mould for a small amount of milk, you're going to get a very flat cheese, and the flatter the cheese, the bigger the surface area. The more tendency it's going to have to dry out very, very quickly, and you're going to lose a lot of moisture content, and it's going to crack. And that's the last thing you want to do when you're ripening your cheese. Anyway, thanks very much, Henry, for your question. Next question is from Caitlin.
Hi, Gavin. This is Caitlin from Redding, California. Enjoy your YouTube videos and your podcasts. My question is, I'd like to make cheese with my children, but they're not always patient. What is a cheese that I can make with them that perhaps could be ready in maybe a couple of hours? Thanks so much.
You're welcome, Caitlin, and thank you for the question. Now, I think your kids would love to make quick mozzarella. Quick mozzarella is one of my favourites, and I think they would be amazed at all of the pulling of the curd when it gets to curd pulling time. It may be a little on the hot side. It depends on how old your kids are, but they could certainly watch mum pulling the cheese, and I would say within 30 minutes you would have some very edible and edible cheese, not saying edible children, edible cheese, and some very delighted children. If you wanted them to participate, it's a difficult one because there's no really cool cheeses that are quick. Even ricotta, which is a very quick cheese, is very hot because you've got to heat it up to like 92 degrees Celsius, which is near boiling. So unfortunately, if you want a quick ricotta, you couldn't even do that either. But yeah, quick mozzarella, I think that's probably your best bet if you were in total control, which I believe you would be. Yeah, give that a go. I think that's probably the best suggestion. If anybody else has got any suggestions, then leave a comment on the webpage associated with this podcast, and I'm sure Caitlin would be more than happy to have a look at those, and she could take action on those. Anyway, the next question is from Mark.
Hello, Gavin. This is Mark from Fredericksburg, Virginia. I want to thank you for your videos. They're very well done, and you're getting better and better each time you do them, so congrats on those. What I'd like to ask, though, let's get straight to the question, is this. What are the things that go wrong when you do too much of something? In fact, you could probably start a series just on that. What if I add too much heat? What if I add too much lipase? What happens if I add too much of something? In fact, if you want to, let's start with rennet. What happens when you add too much rennet? Thank you.
No problems at all, Mark, and thank you very much for your question. Right, too much rennet. What happens? Well, the first thing that happens is your curds set too fast. They go too rubbery, and basically your cheese becomes very flavourless, because what happens is, because they've set so fast, the milk doesn't have time to acidify at the rate it should have. So when you cut the curd, it actually locks in a lot of the whey as well, and it doesn't have a chance to expel as much whey as it should. So two things will happen. It'll be rubbery and lack flavour, and it will be bitter. So there you go. That's what happens when you add too much rennet for the amount of milk that you should have. Yeah, that makes sense. So too much rennet for the amount of milk that you have. So don't over rennet your milk. I'll tackle one more. Too much heat. If you heat your curds too much, then it actually expels too much whey, and your cheese will become too dry, and usually it results in a crumbly cheese instead of a smooth cheese. That'll do. I'll be on too much of a roll. But anyway, thanks for your question, Mark. Not a question mark, but your question mark. Okay, next one. I'll stop being silly. The next one is from Byron.
Hello, Gavin, and thanks for the videos on YouTube. In your wax cheese video, you gave some great tips. My question, did you use a white vinegar or any type of vinegar around the cheese before you sealed it in the wax? Can you cover this question in your podcast and post it on YouTube for me to watch? I would like to understand why or why not to use vinegar and what is happening to the cheese once we seal it in the wax. Thanks and have a wonderful day.
Byron, thank you very much for your question. Now, before I wax the cheese, I make sure that it is free of mould, and I don't do that using vinegar. I do that using a simple brine solution. So if I do see mould on the outside of the cheese, after it has air dried for the usual 2 to 3 days, sometimes it takes, during winter, it does take up to a week. And then sometimes if the cheese is very moist, it may be susceptible to a little bit of blue mould usually, never anything else around here anyway. So I just wipe that off with a simple brine solution, which is basically 1 cup of cooled boiled water to 2 teaspoons of salt. Give that a good stir, and then just wipe your cheese all over with a lint-free cloth. Clean, of course. And then you allow that to just dry off. You just pat it with a paper towel, and that dries it really quickly. And then I put the cheese in the fridge, the whole wheel of cheese in the fridge, and then I pull it out of the fridge when it's still cold, and then wax it, dip it in the wax in it. And you've all seen the waxing video, and it dries the wax really quickly. And then I can do the second coat really quick as well. So vinegar doesn't touch it, doesn't even go near it. And the reason is I don't want to lock in a layer of vinegar underneath the wax, because it may tend to make the cheese a little bit more acidic than I want it to be. because once the cheese is under the wax, it's kind of restricted from oxygen, and the lactic bacteria is slowing down its development. It is still acting upon any lactose that is within the cheese, but what it's starting to do now is act upon some of the fats that are within the cheese and convert those into, it's hard to describe in non-chemistry terms, they're turning them into the flavours that you know and love and the cheeses that you know and love. There's a simple way of saying it. That's what's happening during the maturation time. Because if you sample, and because I sample cheeses all the time during the different ages. So I'll make 2 of the same cheese at the same time, for instance. So I'll crack one open at 3 months, and then I'll eat one at it when it's fully mature, just to see what the difference in flavour is. So if I eat a cheddar at, say, 3 months, I'll note what the flavour's like and whether it's subtle or sharp or what have you, and then I'll eat it at 6 months. And you can really tell the difference in flavour just by another 3 months. And it is the cultures, the bacteria, lactic bacteria still within the cheese, still working on those fats and the lactose within the cheese. So cheese is a living organism. It's an amazing thing. So that's what happens under the wax. Thanks for your question, Byron. I could go on all day about what happens under the wax and what happens during affinage, but really there's whole books written on it. So get yourself a really good cheese-making book, and I'm sure you could be thrilled for hours reading about what happens during the maturation process. Fantastic. Thank you so much to all the people who left a voicemail question. I was blown over when I opened up the SpeakPipe dashboard this morning and saw 6 voicemails. I think it's a record for the show. So keep them coming. I know one thing I did notice, that there was no Australians and no Kiwis, so I think you guys have let the side down. I want to know where you are. Don't hide. I want to hear more from you. So get them in, and I didn't hear anybody from the UK and other places throughout the world. So let's get on it and ask questions. You know where I live. Pop over to littlegreencheese.com/contact-me. It's that easy to leave a voicemail question for the podcast, and I will answer it to the best of my ability. It's that time. For upcoming workshop dates and cheese-making recipes and my ebook, Keep Calm and Make Cheese, head over to littlegreencheese.com to find all these wonderful goodies. If you're after cheese-making equipment, kits and ingredients, head over to littlegreenworkshops.com.au. Thanks for listening, Curd Nerds, and stay tuned for next week's episode of Little Green Cheese Podcast. You've been listening to royalty-free music by Kevin MacLeod. During the show, you heard Malt Shop Bop and Call to the Dairy Cows. See you, Curd Nerds.